Welcome to another 5-minute religious education recap video. We're on the exam board Eduqas. We are looking at foundational Catholic theology and we're exploring the good and evil unit. Today's session is going to focus on Salvifici Doloris, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to highlight what Pope John Paul II taught about evil and suffering in relation to this document. Pope John Paul II, he wrote Salvifici Doloris in 1984 because he wanted to address the problem and the meaning of suffering. A lot of individuals were questioning, how can an all-powerful, omnipotent and all-loving, omnibenevolent God allow evil and suffering? Where does it fit in with his plan? Now, John Paul II, he started off by saying, well, let's look at suffering as being something that is redemptive or saving, which is what that phrase, Salvifici Doloris, literally means. It's redempting or saving suffering. Now, this redemptive suffering, St. John Paul II's aim was to get Catholics to offer their suffering to God, just like Jesus did. So on the screen, you can see an image of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, at this moment, he's praying to God, and he asks for this cup of suffering to pass him by. And he's referring to his death, his crucifixion. And Jesus, in this moment, it's called the agony in the garden. Jesus is praying to God, and he's offering his suffering because he's worrying. He is panicking. But by the end of his prayer, he says, it's not my will, it's your will, God. And what John Paul II wants Catholics to do is to offer their suffering to God, just like Jesus did. Because not only will they get support from God, but also they'll realise that they can suffer for the sake of others. So through their suffering, they can enable others to get to God, just like Jesus did with his sacrifice on the cross. Now on the screen, you can see I've lifted out a few documents from Salvifici Doloris. So these are a few lines from it. Now I've highlighted 4 key areas. So I'm not going to read through this entire thing. You're more than welcome to pause the video and have a read through it so you get your head around it. But these 4 strands I'm going to lift out and look at a little bit of an explanation to go with each one. So first of all, this one says, divine love. This answer has been given by God to man in the cross of Jesus Christ. Now, what John Paul II was trying to say is that Jesus' crucifixion shows God's divine love. It shows God's omnibenevolence, his loving nature. So when we look at suffering, that actually sometimes suffering can show us God's love. And that's one of the key areas coming through. Secondly, the quote says, those who share in Christ's sufferings have before their eyes the paschal mystery of the cross and resurrection. What John Paul wanted to get across was that people who suffer, they share in Jesus' suffering and they become closer to him. So if you are suffering, you're going through something that Jesus went through as well, and therefore you can experience his suffering and his death and his resurrection. So you're becoming more Christ-like through your suffering. Now another strand that I pulled out was, in this weakness there is accomplished his lifting up, confirmed by the power of the resurrection. Now the power of the resurrection and the hope that it brings, it lifts Jesus out of suffering. And the argument now is the second quote, the weakness of all human sufferings are capable of being infused with the same power. If Jesus was human and he overcame his suffering for a greater purpose through the resurrection, then we can also do the same. So human suffering can be defeated by the power of God through Jesus' death and resurrection. So what we're shown is that God's omnipotence and his omnibenevolence come through suffering. Now what I tried to do here was to offer you an example of this in action. And there's a famous person called Padre Pio. He was a devout priest who experienced the suffering of the stigmata. These are the wounds of Christ, so bleeding from his hands. Now, he received these wounds multiple times during his life, but he didn't complain about the pain. He reflected on the pain and he thought about those who were also in pain and how he could best serve them. So Padre Pio, this saving power of suffering, what it meant for him was that he focused upon serving others. Even though he was suffering, he thought, I need to serve others who are also suffering. He felt that he was going through an experience that Jesus had, and therefore it enabled him to develop his relationship with God. And also it highlighted to him that life's not always perfect. Perfection will be achieved in heaven, and this life was preparing him to get ready for heaven. So through his suffering, he becomes closer to God, serves others, and he realizes that this is preparation for heaven. Now, have a little look down this checklist and see if you can link any of these phrases to this idea of Pope John Paul II and Salvifici Doloris. If you can do that, you've been successful today. If you find it a little bit tough, maybe pause the video, go back through it and check it out. If you want to push yourself a little bit further, then maybe go for some of these example questions. For the D-styles, you might have to use a couple of other videos in the series. Thanks so much for your time and best of luck.